Grand homecoming indeed, for Jesus. You know, as human beings, we naturally form groups, we live in groups. The first group we really begin to understand, I think, is our family of origin, the family that we were brought up in, and the extended family. And we get a sense of what it means to be in that group. We recognize there are all kinds of personalities, stronger personalities, weaker personalities, but we find our way in that group, and either we thrive in it or we find that maybe I need to find another group. Not that we disown our families, but sometimes we need something more. It's not uncommon for us to love our own families as well, but also create kind of a secondary family, a different group of folks that we have selectively chosen for any number of reasons. And that group becomes very important to our identity as well. The groups we form may be of people with like mind, politically, religious, socially, and so on and so forth. But these groups become exceedingly important, and they begin to define our relationship with the world. And sometimes these groups, as wonderful as they might be, pose challenges to us, particularly if we start to change in some way outside of the norm of the group that we are currently residing in. Jesus is certainly experiencing this today in Nazareth. But before we get to Jesus, I'm reminded of a parishioner in Fenton, one of my parishioners, and this was in 2020. It was the spring and summer. I was called here and started August in 2020, but before that I was in Fenton. And during that period of time, the biggest single issue going down other than COVID was racial unrest. That was big in the news. A lot of things were going on. And this parishioner of mine came into my office one day and she said, you know, I've been doing a lot of research. And anyway, I've come to the conclusion that systemic racism is a real issue. And the problem, though, she said, I have is that the group I hang out with absolutely does not believe that. And nor did I, but I have come through a change. And she was really worried, and she was uncomfortable, and she was sad, and she said, you know, if I shared my feeling about this issue, I'm afraid they would disown me. These people I've been with for so many years. She had a dilemma, you know. How do I deal with this? We've all been through it before in different ways. I said to her, I said, well, you know, God, you got a couple choices. Either don't say anything and just, you know, go on, but it feels like you need to say something. I said, the main thing I would suggest, though, is to remember always that all people are sacred. No matter what their positions are in life, no matter what their opinions are, no matter what, each person is a child of God, no matter what. And if you can share your experience with that understanding and not judge and, you know, just get up on a soapbox, maybe your dear friends will appreciate your honesty, recognizing it couldn't have been easy. So I don't know actually what happened, you know, if that happened or not, but it was an interesting conversation. And it was one of those things that as we evolve in our lives and as we change in our lives, the groups that we are part of may or may not, you know, things need to be readjusted always. Now, Jesus experiences this today in today's gospel. He, you know, last week we saw Jesus preach and he read the script from Isaiah and said, I preach good news to the poor and so on. one thing leads to another, and then someone asked the question, is this not Joseph's son? Now, to keep this in mind, Nazareth is truly, if there was a podunk town, it was Nazareth. You know, maybe 4 families or clans emerged together. It's small. I remember in the early gospel stories about Jesus calling his disciples, and someone came to Nathanael who said, you know, Jesus is of Nazareth is starting this whole movement. And Nathanael said, does anything good come out of Nazareth? It didn't have much of a fanfare, but in any event, Nazareth is poor. It's definitely poor. It's small. And back in the day, people just did not move out of their hometowns. This just doesn't happen. This society is set in, you know, you're born somewhere, and in that place you grow up, and then you die. And that's the way it works. And you work and you help the local economy the best you can. And the thought of leaving home was generally unheard of. And if someone did leave home, it was viewed as a rejection of the hometown and their values, et cetera, et cetera. And beyond that, we see Nazareth as, one, it is Jewish, and it seems to be reasonably active in its faith. It does have a synagogue, and people go on Sabbath to worship and this type of thing. But keeping that in mind, the people who would be worshiping in Nazareth and throughout Palestine of the Jewish tradition have a certain worldview, you see. You're either in or you're out. You are either in the Torah, what we call the first 5 books of the Bible, and all the laws and the 10 commandments that are originally brought out a few times. You're either in Torah or you're out of Torah. Now, you could be in Torah and be Jewish. You could be out of Torah and be Jewish because you're not practicing the faith. But the worldview suggests that if you're not Jewish, you're simply not in Torah. And Torah, the practice of Torah, generates God's mercy. So you're in God's mercy if you practice Torah, you're out of God's mercy if you don't. So this is the reality that Jesus is working with. Now, I love these particular lessons when it seems to me anyway, when we pick up that human Jesus. He had to be, he had to be nervous coming back to his hometown, recognizing some of these differences. And when the question is asked, is this not Joseph's son? Well, you could hear it said in a variety of different ways, to be sure. It could be an acclamation or it could be a judgment, But my sense is that Jesus was feeling defensive, is what I kind of pick up on it. He comes right out of the chute making assumptions about people. He says, I'm sure you would want me to stay here and heal you the way you hear I've healed people in Capernaum. And then he makes the statement, a prophet is without honor in his hometown. He's just saying, you don't honor me. And your beliefs are suspect. The fact of the matter is, Elijah, during his ministry, there was a famine for 3.5 years. And he wasn't called to care for the Jews during those years. He goes to a widow in Zarephath who was not Jewish. And I'll go one better, Elisha. All the leprosy that was in the land. And he goes only to one, Naaman the Syrian. It just feels like he's poking the bear, one poke after another, until finally he gets a pretty stiff response. And they invite him out of the synagogue and want to throw him off a cliff. Well, the good news is he didn't fall off the cliff. But it is interesting that Jesus, I don't think he ever went back to Nazareth. I think that was it. There doesn't appear to be any biblical evidence that he visited his hometown again. He just continued to move forward. Groups are tough. Families, hometowns, relationships, change. It's frightening. Growth is frightening. Change is frightening. I guess the good news in all this, and it's not that cheery of a story, it really isn't. It's just hard stuff to think about, to be sure. But I guess the good news, minimally, is that we get this reconfirmation that God is for everyone, not just Jew or Greek, but everyone. Jesus does get this point across. It's not all that welcome, but he gets it across. And he survives to continue his ministry, and that's something too. And maybe it's good news to recognize this Jesus that we profess is fully God and fully man does experience the same kinds of challenges we experience as we grow, as we evolve, as we try to make sense out of this thing called life. With that said, it gives us an opportunity to think about our own lives and what groups do we belong to. And I'm not talking about groups that are focused on a specific subject like a Bible study group or the choir or, Al-Anon meetings. I'm thinking about more of those kinds of groups that are kind of like family, either the secondary family or back into the family. Those groups that relationships are built on a variety of different perspectives. And if we are in those groups, how do they impact our lives? How do they impact our understanding of God's love? How does that all work? One of the challenges of groups that are formed on mutual identity, and there's many blessings, of course, but one of the challenges, I think, to God's mercy is that sometimes the informal secondary family groups that we create based on maybe a similar view of politics and different social things and this and that and whatnot, sometimes there's the possibility for the group to become judgmental of those who are not in the group. This can happen. It can surface. And it gets into that inny-outy thing, that mercy map. You're either in the group or you're out. You're in or out. We kind of do that. And it's something we need to always guard against. And Groups are powerful, but they can build walls as well. And we need to be aware of that. We need to not allow our lives to be stilted somehow. It's an interesting challenge. In the end, I think that as we move forward with our lives and with our faith and with our relationships, if we can carry forward this fundamental notion that all life is sacred, all life is valued, all life is important, even if I don't understand it. If we can be humbled enough to say, boy, why don't I understand? Why am I so quick to judge? What am I missing? If we can practice that in our lives, we will open all kinds of interesting doors. And I think we've all done that too. We've experienced that. We've had examples of that happening. So our faith is more or less extended, not so much in group, to some extent, but more in the one-on-one. How do we relate to others? The great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was kind of he was a Hall of Famer in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Lutheran origin, a professor of theology at Union Seminary in New York City. Niebuhr spent most of his career studying compassion and unpacking every dimension of compassion. He said, compassion is at its strongest when it's one-on-one. And once the person leaves the one-on-one experience and drifts back into group, we can watch compassion dissipate, and dissipate rather rapidly. So in the end, it's good for us to recognize who we are, what our faith is, and what the opportunities we have to share. And sometimes, while the news is good, maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's just more than anything else, something to think about. Amen.